Welcome to Being Human. I'm your host, Steve Cuss. As always, just a great pleasure to be with you. I hope this podcast is beneficial to you. I'll say for me, it's a real highlight of my week, not just where I get to share with you, but where I get to meet some amazing people. And today's guest is no exception. I got to interview Lisa Fields. Lisa is the author of this wonderful new book, When Faith Disappoints. What's fascinating about that is she and I are both exploring the same idea that we have a gap between what we believe about God and what we experience from God. In fact, if you look up Lisa's book, which is linked in the show notes, and if you look up my book, we have like word for word the same subtitle. I love that. I love that there's a couple of us wanting to help people mind the gap between our head beliefs and our body beliefs. What we believe when we read scripture versus what we believe when we experience life. Lisa Fields is a world-class apologist, an apologetic specialist. She runs the Jude 3 Project, which is dedicated particularly in people of African descent, African Americans and people around the world. She's particularly focused on making a case for Christianity in that context. What I particularly love about Lisa is that she does it in a fresh way. She's not so much interested in making an argument as listening and asking questions. And you'll really see that as we get into this interview. This was a great conversation. I think we're all really going to benefit from it. Before we get to Lisa and before we light the candle, I do have a favor to ask you. If you haven't had a chance to do this yet, I'm going to ask if you consider doing one or two things for us. Number one, would you leave a written review of this show? It really does help us spread the word. And if you leave a written review, we will read it on the air. We'll share it with others. For example, M5 Mom. Here's a review in from M5 Mom. Does that mean that mom has 5 kids? Probably. Here's what she said. This podcast has quickly become a Sunday night ritual for me. As I prepare for the week, there's nothing that helps me tune in to how I'm doing and how I'm experiencing God quite like this podcast. Profound truth presented in a winsome and compassionate way. Thanks so much, M5 Mom. If you'd be willing to leave a review, that would be a great gift to us. But also, would you just take a moment and think of one or two people in your life that might benefit from this show? And would you share an episode with them? You can help us spread the word as well. Okay, we are in a season in this episode where we're really focusing on noticing anxiety. What's going on in me? What's going on around us? And we have this in some specific ways. Just as we do, we're going to light our candle, just as a tangible reminder that perfect love casts out fear. You know, when I read that passage in John where John says perfect love casts out fear, I think the problem is, I think it's a one and done situation. Right? Like, well, God perfectly loves me, therefore I should never be afraid. I have found it much more helpful to use the promises of Scripture situationally rather than expecting it to be a one and done in my life. So perfect love casts out all fear. Yes, that's true. What's probably true is we'll be afraid again, maybe even today, but we can just take a little moment of relief right now, light the candle, relax into God's presence and encounter the love of God, stub our toe on the love of God. Okay, here's my conversation with Lisa. Lisa, you're a preacher's kid. Tell us what that was like.
Yeah, I've been in church all my life. I was born on a Sunday while my my dad was at church. Obviously, my mom went into labor. So he had to leave church to meet my mom at the hospital. So my whole life has been encompassed by church. I have no negative kind of experience growing up as a PK. To me, my life was pretty normal, but I guess normal based off PK standards. And so obviously church was all encompassing. And that's why I never wanted to be in ministry because I just knew the sacrifices my parents made and it just took so much of their life. And also we were in church all the time. So when I graduated, college. Well, when I was going into college, I said once I graduate from college, I'm going to go to a mega church and sit in the back because I didn't want to be in church all the time. I wanted to, as soon as it was the benediction came, I wanted to be out. And so that was pretty much my experience.
It's always interesting to notice when a child becomes aware of something, like maybe they've felt it and sensed it, but then they know it. And a lot of PKs, there's a moment where they realize, man, my parents have it tough. Like there's tremendous pressure on them. There's some criticism. Does that ring any bells with you? Does that raise up an example in you where you remember that moment?
Um, I think I just knew that, like, my dad was bivocational for most of my life. And so just him having to get off of work, going to hospital visits, it was just to me all encompassing. And so I think that's when I don't know if an age or time when I realized, but I was just like, this is a lot to do. You have to like really feel called to do it. It's not something you just do because you think it's cool. Especially when you're a bivocational pastor, you have to literally feel called to do it because you have to balance your family, you have to balance your 40-hour work week on your job and a church. And so, yeah.
I'm excited to get into your book, When Faith Disappoints, the gap between what we believe and what we experience. One of the things that tickles me, we were chatting before we hit record, my audience would know that that's such a similar subtitle to my most recent book. You and I share a passion of helping people encounter what we believe. But your book takes this wonderful direction of what do we do with our doubt?
Mhm.
What do we do with deconstruction and reconstruction? Lisa, I want to get to that in a little bit, but I'm curious, when you're a preacher's kid or when you're a pastor, the pressure to represent the faith and represent something while you yourself are questioning. What's your word to pastors or PKs now that are going through that?
Yeah, I think that vulnerability is the key to freedom, not only for ourselves, but for others. Because when we present this false reality that we don't have any doubts or we don't struggle with the faith sometimes, then people watching us think that they're in sin when they're doubting or when they're feeling frustration. And so it builds this like community of people feeling like they have to lie for other people to be healed or saved. And it's like, actually, for people to come to know God in a deep, meaningful way, we have to be vulnerable and honest about our own doubts. So they'll be liberated to know how to deal with their doubts. So many people walk away from the faith because they start doubting and they don't know what to do. And if pastors and leaders, PKs haven't modeled that this is a part of relationship with God, then people think, well, I don't have an authentic relationship with God, so I just need to leave. And so I really wanted this book to really normalize that doubting is a part of the Christian experience. We all doubt. We all have questions. People in the scriptures are filled with questions in times when they've doubted. So I wanted to normalize it because I think it frees us from having to be perfect,
Yeah, it
which we
tickles
can
me
never
to.
actually be.
Yeah, right. Yeah, a target will never hit anyway. It tickles me to no end that you left college and said, right, let me sit in the back row of the biggest megachurch I can. And next thing we know, you have a Master of Divinity degree. You go into ministry. You become the founder of this wonderful organization, the Jude 3 Project. Tell us about the Jude 3 Project. What an incredible mission it has.
Yeah, the Jude 3 project is based on Jude 3. As we all know, Jude doesn't have any other chapters but the first. And
Best book in
so,
the Bible. You knock it out so quickly.
yes, earnestly contend for the faith. And so, really, it is a Christian apologetics organization focused on equipping and engaging the Black community. So, we equip Black Christians and engage Black skeptics through our work. We do that in a multiplicity of ways through courses, in person events, film. We have two documentaries, Unspoken and Juneteenth, Faith and Freedom. And so we have a host of and many other YouTube series that we've done where I've sat down with young adults who left the faith. That's our really popular series, Why I Don't Go. And so those are just a little bit, that's a little bit about the Jude 3 Project.
Yeah, and you also have a number of podcasts as well for
Yeah.
folks who love a good podcast. You yourself host a podcast. I'm assuming that your interest in Jude isn't simply limited to verse 3. You probably, I hope, would also appreciate 22, where Jude
Yes.
says, "Be merciful to those
Merciful
who
to those who
doubt."
die. Yes, yes. That resonates with me. That's one of my favorite passages of scripture. Um, and it took on a new meaning me recently when I was thinking about Jude and how he was the brother of Jesus. And in
Yeah.
John, it says that none of his brothers believed. And so Jude can have mercy on those who doubt because he knows what it's like to doubt himself, to spend so much time with Jesus. There was never a time in his adult life that he didn't know Jesus because Jesus was the firstborn. And so he had all of these years with Jesus and spent a significant amount of time doubting that Jesus was actually who he says he was. So when he writes, "Be merciful to those who doubt," he actually is coming from a place of experience. Like, I needed mercy when I was doubting that my brother was actually the Son of God. So I can extend this mercy to others who are wrestling with their own doubt.
Yeah, I love it. And then for you, you voiced that doubt in seminary to
Mhm.
your New Testament professor. I'd love if you'd share that journey with us.
Yeah, so I'm in seminary and I heard a story of kids being murdered by terrorists. And it just hit me in a way that it hadn't hit me before. Because I was like, God, you're all knowing, all powerful, all loving. You can stop this. To me, kids, like they represent innocence. They haven't done anything to deserve this. And if you love me more than my parents, I have really great parents. I know if they knew something was going to happen that they could stop because of their love for me, they would stop it. So when you're telling me that you love me more than my parents, where was your love for these children? And I went to my New Testament professor, Dr. Leo Purser, like, Dr. Purser, I really don't understand why God is allowing this. And Dr. Purser is not only a New Testament professor, but he's the director of apologetics. He was the director of the apologetics program at the time. And he said to me too. And I'm thinking I'm going to get some grand answer, but he knew that I already knew the answer, the apologetic responses. He knew I could already articulate the problem of evil or greater good, all of those things. He knew that. But he offered me, I think, in that moment, vulnerability. And it was an incarnational approach, I felt like, that was really helpful to help me shape my ministry. That moment showed me, like, among others, like, I remember asking him a question in class and he was like, "That's a good question. I don't know." And I'm thinking, he just felt so free to say that, which made me feel free to say, "I don't know," when I'm asked the question, even though we're in a New Testament class and he says he doesn't know, he has a PhD in New Testament. That freed me up to be like, I can say, "I don't know." That freed me up to say, "Me too. I struggle with that too." And so it just was like a real transformative experience, um, because he modeled to me what I think I needed to model in my ministry.
Yeah, and so began this wonderful book. And folks listening, it's brand new. When Faith Disappoints, the gap between what we believe and what we experience. Lisa, one of the things you lay out in there is pain points. It's such a fascinating way to look at our doubt and our
Mm,
deconstruction through the lens of a pain point. Like a good preacher, you have many of them all starting with a letter P. Thank you for
mm,
that.
yes.
We don't have time to go into all of them, but I do want to pull out three. Lack of personhood. That's one of the pain points you mentioned. Tell us what that is.
Yeah. So many people that are deconstructing their faith in this current moment are looking for a faith that gives them identity. It shows them that they have value and they're worth something. Especially in the African American community, many people have converted to things like Hebrew Israelism or African spiritualism because it gives them a sense of identity and value. And so I really wanted to highlight that the pain point of personhood is a pain point for many of us Many of us are struggling trying to figure out who we are. Do we have value and do we have worth? And the church answer is always, of course you have value, you have worth. You're made in the image of God, right? But what I've discovered is that many people don't really have an accurate understanding of who God is. So because they don't have an accurate understanding of who God is, being made in his image doesn't mean much, right? You can't really value that you're made in the image of God if you don't know who God is. And so in the chapter, I really try to not just delve into telling you you're made in the image of God, you're valuable, but also highlighting who God is so you would see the significance of being made in his image.
I keep thinking about the early church, particularly in the book of Acts and then the first couple of 100 years, and just the way the church exploded in growth and population. And I think a big part, I know a lot of people have written on this, I think a big part is simply that in the Roman Empire, most of us were disposable and exploitable. And in the church, we had identity. I think that's a lot of what you're reclaiming for us. It feels like in 2024, that's in desperate need of reclaim. It feels to me, at least, Lisa, that our culture really is pitting us against each other.
Yes.
And that the church does have another opportunity to become a place of refuge where everyone has dignity.
Yes. Yeah. I believe that. And I think, I talk about we have these categories for people. We dehumanize or we deify. So we have our heroes and we deify them. If they fall, we dehumanize them. We never allow them to be in the category of human. And so when we see people as human, we're able to see ourselves. We're able to respect them. We're able to give them grace. We're able to give them compassion. And then there's people who look down. I talk a lot about how in America, African Americans or slaves were seen as 3/5 of a person. So we were dehumanized. So, and then almost white people were deified. And so it's like, hey, I want wherever you put, whether you put people too high or you put people too low, for those who put too high, bring them down. For those you put too low, bring them up. And we all meet at being human, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I love it. It's a beautiful vision. One of the other pain points you mentioned is pleasure. I think
Mhm.
this is such a fascinating idea that we should be looking at that. Tell us about that.
Yeah, it really the pleasure conversation. I started off with a conversation I had with one of the guys that actually left the faith, and he wanted to sit down with me to kind of do an exit interview of why he left the faith. And he was explaining to me all of these things. And he started off, with why loving God would allow people to go to hell. And he just jumped. You've been in those conversations where people jump from objection to objection, and they never really let you talk about the objection they're speaking to, because before you could tackle one, they're on another. And so that's how that conversation went. And it almost lasted for 4 hours. But at the end of the conversation, after listening to him, we got to the fact that he wanted to be able to have sex with his girlfriend without judgment, right? So his pain point was pleasure. He felt like that God was stopping him from having some form of joy and pleasure in life. And so I really wanted to reframe pleasure, because when we think about pleasure, immediately Christians can say, okay, that's wrong. But they don't realize that just like he was searching for pleasure in all the wrong places, we oftentimes search for pleasure in the wrong places, whether it be with food, whether it be with over shopping, whether it be spending hours and hours on social media to get a like or to post a picture that you get approval or acceptance, some kind of form of pleasure. Shopping to escape your problems, looking for pleasure. I mean, it's traveling to escape your problems, looking for pleasure. I wanted to talk and make people aware so that won't necessarily condemn the people that they feel like are doing the worst things. They're like, oh, sex, drugs, and alcohol. We know that's bad. But so many of people in the church don't do those things and give themselves a pat on the back, but they overeat, they overspend. And it's like, well, this is the same thing. It's just taking on different. So I wanted to normalize that, but I also wanted to think through, like, pleasure is neutral. It's our way we get pleasure that turns it good or bad. So God wants us to have pleasure. He gave Adam and Eve everything in the garden to enjoy, to have pleasure. Like he wants us to have pleasure within the context of our marriage. So God designs us to have things that bring us pleasure, but there can be things that we use that make the pleasure harmful to us. And so I wanted people to think about that in a different way.
Oh, I think about you sitting down with a fellow for almost 4 hours as he bounces around like he won't settle on any of the cases you're making, and then you find out at the end he's just trying to justify him and his girlfriend. You must have been tempted to invoice him for like 3.5 hours of like, just get to the point, man. You know?
Well, I feel like I tell people apologetics is more about listening than talking.
Okay.
Because you don't really know what their core issue is or what their core pain point is until they listen, because people don't start with the heart of the matter. They have to talk their way to it. And if I start arguing with you about science and faith, then I will miss that actually this is your issue. Or if I start arguing with you about evolution, then I don't realize that you are still brokenhearted that you prayed for God to save your mom and she died of cancer. Like, so it takes a while to listen so people can talk themselves into their actual issue. And we have to be humble enough as apologists to listen, to say, I don't have to object at everything I disagree with because I'm trying to figure out what is your actual issue.
Lisa, I really can't express how grateful I am for what you just said, because I feel like 1990s and early 2000s apologetics was all about not just an argument, but almost a smugness in being right. No,
Mm-hmm.
I don't mean to make it that across the board. I'm sure there are exceptions, but it felt like it was so pugilistic.
Mm-hmm.
And so long as I could outwit you, I've won.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I I'd love to hear more from you on this. You must be doing the Jude 3 project as a counter argument for all of that.
Yeah, so I believe apologetics. I read a long time ago in this book, a popular encyclopedia for apologetics, that apologetics has two streams. And I like to think of it as two wings on a plane: informational, which is what you're speaking to, but incarnational. And both of them are equally important, right? So I would say, when you get on a plane, which would you rather travel with, the left wing or the right wing? And nobody is saying, I want the left or the right, because we know if you don't have two wings, you're not going anywhere, right? I think apologetics doesn't go far in the life of the church, in the life of culture, if we just have information without incarnational. Part of being incarnational is embodying the love of Jesus and how the humility of Jesus. I'm always marveled that Jesus was on this earth 30 years and we don't have much of what he said outside of that time when he was 12. How much he heard about God that wasn't true, that he was like, I don't have to defend that right now. I'll let that go until it's time for me to say something. And I think incarnational ministry is about that. Like, there's tons of things even in that conversation that I heard that I could have corrected from that guy. But it's like, is that important right now? Is that the key issue that I need to tackle? And I think that for me, if we don't embody, we have the information when it's needed. When we get to the heart of the question, we're able to articulate those answers. But oftentimes, those answers are needed after we've been incarnational and we've built trust and we've earned the right to talk. And that's kind of been my approach.
It's so good, Lisa. The Jude 3 project, anybody can benefit from it, but you are particularly targeting people of African descent,
Mhm.
in the United States, African American, but really even globally. What would you say are a couple of distinctives of apologetics in African descent versus majority culture here in the States?
So one of the biggest one is this Christianity, white man's religion. Because of the history of Christianity in America, even globally on the continent with colonialism. Um, I think when we think about like the history and when we think about the fact that slave masters use the Bible to further oppress people, using slaves submit to your masters as a way for them to dehumanize, you see why people have an issue with faith. And so we do a lot about talking about the history of Christianity on the continent, talking about early African Christian fathers like Tertullian, Athanasius, that these people were African church fathers that we still hold to the doctrines that they taught us today. And by them being Africans, it shows that Africans were Christians long before the transatlantic slave trade. And so that's been a helpful way in which we use church history as a defense for the faith.
There is a lot of anxious deconstruction happening right now. I see a lot of it in majority culture. Do you also see that in African American culture?
Yeah, yeah. A lot of people are deconstructing for that reason. They want to get to a faith that affirms their identity, that doesn't see them as less than. And so people are leaving, going to Hebrew ritualism, going to African spirituality, and saying, I need a faith that affirms my identity. And so, yes, we're seeing a lot of deconstruction.
Yeah. I have let one of your pain points dangle. We've been hinting around it, but power, that's the one I wanted to get your take on briefly on. What are you addressing with the pain point of power?
Yeah, so many people feel powerless, whether they've been sexually violated, whether they've been mistreated by police. And they're like, I never want to experience that again. I never want to experience powerlessness again. And so they pursue power as a means of healing, right? So sometimes we see people on the pursuit of power and we're just like, man, they're really passionate about that. And we're like, that's unhealthy. But it's like, what is underneath that? We don't often see power as a cure for pain from some people, that some people are pursuing it because they want to be in control so they never have to feel the pain they once felt. And so in the chapter, I'm really arguing that power, the pursuit of power, won't heal the pain of the trauma you've experienced. And only Jesus actually can heal you. And even if you're in a powerful position, you still will experience pain. So I'm really challenging people to understand, like, I understand why you want the pursuit of power. I understand that you want a faith, whether that be crystals, manifestation, where you feel like I get to take control of my atmosphere, I get to take control of my destiny. But those are all false realities. And so because we can never have control, we have to really surrender ourselves to the one who's actually in control, and that is Jesus. And surrendering ourselves to Jesus will be the way in which we are healed from the traumas we've experienced.
Yeah, you mentioned a couple of potential trauma situations that could put someone in a desire for power out of protection. I mean, surely trauma deeply affects our faith and our trust in God. What have you seen there? I'd love to hear more from you on that.
Yeah, so many people. I mean, I feel like we all have degrees of trauma in our lives. That's the common shared experience. We've all experienced trauma on some level. I have friends that have gone through deep, deep traumas, um, sexual violations that they can't even often put into words because
Yeah.
the pain is so deep. And so I want to make sure that in whatever apologetic we're doing and when we're dealing with people, we're stewarding them with care, knowing that people are navigating trauma and many people deconstruct from a place of trauma. And so because of that, I'm like, let me listen to your story. I know that's why I don't go serious is so important. And I think struck a chord with so many. I listen to people's stories. I know you don't go to church. I know you hate church right now. I understand you're a little iffy on the Bible. I know you're iffy about God. Let me listen. Where did this start from you for you? How did you get there? When did you first start feeling like this? Because I feel like, okay, this is a person that's traumatized. And when you're traumatized, it's hard to see things clearly. And it's hard to often articulate even your experiences with a level of um nuance, right? Because you're not there yet. And I think I just really, when I see people talking about deconstruction and they're really beating people, like, why are you deconstructing? That's of the devil. They're taking this hardline approach. I'm like, man, these people are hurting. When I was hurting, when I was navigating, I couldn't imagine me coming in my professor's office and him saying, how could you think this? God loves you. He loved those kids. Like, why are you thinking like this? We taught you about the goodwill argument. Like, I don't know what that would have done to me in that moment.
Yeah.
And so that's how I think about it. Like, how can I connect with this person to see what they're experiencing?
Lisa, our podcast audience has been on a journey where this episode, you're actually the culmination of a theme that we're going to move into, you and I together, which is understanding our false needs that feel real in the moment. My field is chronic anxiety, and chronic anxiety kind of makes you think you're under threat when you're really not. So, for example, if you're avoiding a car accident or what we were just talking about, a violent situation, that's a real threat. You need to get to safety. But for me, at least, letting somebody down because I'm a people pleaser is not a real threat, but it sure feels like it in the moment. And so the driving question we've been kicking around with our audience and with my guests is, what is something that you think you need that you don't really need to be okay?
That's a great question. For the last couple years, I could say that I was desiring a particular friendship that I thought I needed to be okay, right? And I didn't actually need it because I'm, as my therapist often tells me, you're surrounded by love. Like, I have a loving family, very close family. I have friends, but it was this one particular friendship that I thought I needed because it was like my best friend, and I felt like I was losing that friendship. And I was like, if I don't have this, then I'm not going to be okay. And now that I'm away from that relationship, I realize I'm okay. Like, I'm okay. I don't need it. That I would desire this person to be in my life, but I didn't actually need it. But at the moment when it was crumbling, I felt like I needed it. And that need was blinding me to all the other things I had in my life that was actually sustaining me. So it created this false perception. I put so much energy in trying to keep it and trying to hold on to it when I actually didn't need it at all.
It's such a great example because we all do this. We all kind of get drunk in the moment and lose our minds. And then we look back, we're like, why? What was I doing? One of the things that's interesting and helpful for our audience is if we go back to that situation, we can start to look at what kinds of things did you do to try to get it that you now look back and say, that was crazy. So for me, for example, one of my false needs is to be there for others when they're hurting. To an exaggerated point, I struggle to tell the difference between your need and my need to be needed. And
Hmm.
so one of the things I do to get it is I overcommit. I really struggle to say no. If we go back to this situation, was there one or two things where you look back and you say, oh, here's what I was doing to try to get it, and it was just making it worse?
Yeah. One was denying my own need for reciprocity in relationship. So any healthy relationship that's going to be close needs to have reciprocity. And so denying being overly helpful because this person was experiencing trauma. And I think because I was raised the way I was, and I'm a PK, what I've come to understand with therapy, like sometimes you take on pastoral care in relationships that's not needed, right? So it's like I see my friend hurting and I want to over insert myself in this. So if you need help with a work project, if you need help with, and it's like I'm overreaching now. I know you're asking me for help, but also I need to have healthy boundaries. I cannot save you. And so I thought that the more I helped, the more it would help the relationship. But the more I helped, it didn't. It actually, people start to take your help for granted. And you're like, I'm sacrificing this. But when people are in pain, they can only see your pain. They can't see they can only see their pain. They can't see the impact of what they're doing to you. And so when I finally was able to get to a healthier place and voice my frustration, the person was like, no, your pain is nothing compared to mine. And then I still tried to say, you know what, you're right. And so I think the healthy space was saying that even if I don't have a traumatic background like you, even if I'm not experiencing a physical ailment like you, my pain still matters. I cannot stuff my pain because I feel like your pain is more severe. And so that was getting to a healthier place. But I think for a while I just thought I just need to stuff like this stuff. I need to stuff the ways in which I feel like you're not showing up for me. And because I want to sustain a relationship that's not healthy.
Mm. That's so good. It's so helpful. One of the interesting things too with chronic anxiety is when we get reactive, we either get bigger than human sized or we get smaller than human sized. You know, when we're bigger than human sized, we tend to dominate and take over. That like over functioning, what you were just describing as like an over functioning. When we get smaller than human sized, we go into self protection. We're like a turtle in our shell. It's a very common experience when you are, for example, an African American woman and you walk into a room with majority culture. Maybe you're the only Black woman in the room.
Mhm.
Tell us what that's like for you.
Yeah. So I think it makes me feel sometimes that I walk into a room feeling like I'm carrying the whole African American experience on my back. Um, I think for a long time it was like I have to represent well because I know people. I've walked into rooms and people immediately start majority culture immediately start talking about inner cities, like all of these like very interesting stereotypes, right? And I'm like, that's not me. I grew up in the suburbs. My parents are together. Uh, like I didn't grow up in the inner city. So I didn't grow up in a life of struggle. So sometimes I feel like I have to represent like a different perspective of our culture because people have stereotypes. So I sometimes creates a level of anxiousness, like I'm trying to change people's minds. Um, and so that's often what I walk into a space thinking through.
Mm,
I don't think I carry it as much as I used to, but I do still, I think, carry that.
okay. And then for our listeners, not our viewers, you may have noticed, Lisa, that I'm a white man.
Mhm.
What would you, as a Black woman, like me, as a white man, to know that I may not know?
Um, I think I often walk into conversations with white men and women wanting them to just see us as African Americans as human that go through the same struggles. Oftentimes it's like, well, I enter conversations, well, how do we talk or how do we, and it's like, be human. Like, don't make it weird. Just be yourself, and build relationships apart from the obvious difference. Like, they're try to build around similarities and strengthen around similarities before you go to differences. And I think that's any relationship. So you have rapport and they have a level of trust that allows them to have hard conversations with you.
Okay. Lisa Fields, you have grown up as a preacher's kid, which means you have probably either had a story shared about you from the pulpit or possibly been corrected by your father during a sermon. You have successfully navigated the Greek and Hebrew that comes along with a Master of Divinity. You've published your first book. You have founded an amazing organization, the Jude 3 Project, that is shifting the conversation of apologetics away from argument and into curiosity and listening. However, you have not yet successfully endured the being human gauntlet of anxiety questions. So without further ado, here we go. First question, I think we have 5 questions for you today, rapid fire style. Number 1, how do you know when you're not well?
For me, it's when I'm not in my devotional time. When I stop praying and reading. I talk about this often. 2020, I hit a wall, burnout. And because I was busy, so busy, I wasn't reading, praying. I wasn't spending time with the Lord outside of when I had to preach and teach. It's like, I need you to help me to fulfill this. And I felt very used by God, because I was like, I feel used and not loved. But in reality, also, I was actually using God and not loving him. And it all played into every dynamic of my life. I felt used and loved by God. I felt used and loved by that particular friend. But I also didn't realize that I was doing the same thing. So the very thing I was accusing God of, I was using him to get a sermon. I was using him to help me when I preached, but I wasn't loving him every day devotionally, right? Um, and so I think that's when I know that I'm not well, when my prayer life and my devotional life has slipped, because I go into using mode, not loving mode. And then everything else is out of whack. My relationships are out of whack. Uh, my I'm still, because I'm gifted communicator, I can still communicate, but it's coming from a place of, it's not overflowing from my devotional life. It's something I need. And I think God allows you to communicate well in spaces where he needs to bless people. So he could bless people using you, but not be pleased with you. And so that's how I know I'm not well.
Excellent. Question number two. Two dynamics that infect every relationship are assumptions and reactivity. Where have you seen people get reactive when assumptions are flying around?
Um, I think I could speak for me on that. I've seen myself assume things and react because I didn't have the courage enough to ask the questions. Mm. It's sometimes easier to assume than to be brave to ask. And so, I always want to, when I tell the story about, since we've talked about my former friend, there's a lot of assumptions that I made that I reacted on that was unhealthy, that actually caused damage. So I always talk about, like, even though I could tell the story about my friend, and I never want to seem like I was a victim. I was a victim and a villain.
Hmm.
And I think in every relationship that crumbles, we all contribute to it in some way on just average interpersonal. Now, there's sometimes we're not villains at all, but in our average relationships that crumble, we're often contributing. And one of the ways I contributed was reacting to assumptions without having the courage to ask the questions or call things out when I should have. And so I'll speak for me on that one, and I won't speak for anybody else. But
Yeah.
I've done that.
Okay, great. How do you keep your heart open?
So for me, it is realizing that no one hurts us. Most of the people that hurt us unintentionally. Like, we catch strays from a lot of people. Everybody's dealing with their own stuff. And the older I get, more I realize people are dealing with their own stuff. And half of the stuff that happens to us is not even intended for us. We caught people on a bad day, a bad season. They're trying to navigate their own traumas. They don't even know they're doing things. Jesus on the cross said, "Forgive them, for they know not what they do." And that's most people that hurt us. They don't know what they're doing. It's only later in their life they look back and was like, "Oh my gosh, I didn't realize." And it is realizing that I need grace. And because I need grace, that I give grace. I need mercy, so I give mercy. And that's what helps me keep my heart open. Lisa, you are not perfect. I know you feel like the victim right now, but what have you done to cause, what is your part in this? Or I know you feel like the victim in this situation, but you've been a villain in other situations. How can you come in here saying, I also need your mercy. I also need your grace. How can I give it in this situation? And that helps me keep my heart open.
Hmm. You deal so much with people in deconstruction. Oftentimes that's attached to giving up on church attendance. People are like, the church is the last place I want to go. So I'm sensitive to people in that position. However, I'm fascinated by What do you think the church offers that you can't get anywhere else?
You know, J- Jesus, in all the complexity of community, all the difficulty in community. I think we see another side of Jesus in the community of faith, like that you cannot get in isolation. So many people say, I deconstruct, it's me and my personal relationship with God. It's like, actually, God has designed us to get healing in community, particularly in the community of faith. My dad always says, forgiveness of sin comes from confession to God, healing from the impacts of the sins done to us, and the sins we commit come through confession to people. That's that James passage, confess your faults one to another, pray for one another so you can be healed. Something about healing that God has placed in community. That without the community of faith, coming together, confessing, and then praying for one another, healing cannot take place. So it's actually not, you can't actually get healed just with you and God. Uh, it's like, God is like, no, you actually need people for healing. And so I think that's what the church offers that no other place does.
Wonderful. The final question is, when in your life lately have you felt most fully and completely loved?
So my grandmother died 3 weeks ago. She fell and hit her head and passed away. She was 85. And I had to fly down to Florida, where I'm from, and all our family came in. It was about 30 of us in the hospice room because she hit her head. They still kept her alive so everybody could get there. And we were all surrounding my grandmother. My grandmother is amazing. My grandfather died in 2020. They were married over 62 years. And we all surrounded family just crying as they took off the support and we watched her transition. And I think I felt the most love. We were all crying because she loved us so well. We have a very close family. And I felt the most love just hugging my brothers, hugging my parents, hugging my cousins, my aunts and uncles. Because we all shared that we were all in pain, but we were all there for each other. Mm-hmm. And even if even though my grandmother was transitioning, I felt like she was still there for us. Like we could feel her love. Like we were all there. Usually they only let 4 or 5 people in the hospice room, but they were like, your family is so large. It's like the nurses were kind to let all 30 of us in there to just surround her. And so I felt like an overwhelming presence of love in that moment.
That's a very fresh story, Lisa, but it's intimate, isn't it? When somebody transitions, it's really quite a holy experience.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. My guest is Lisa Fields. She's the founder of the Jude 3 Project. Her book, When Faith Disappoints, The Gap Between What We Believe and What We Experience. Hey, audience, if you have an idea of apologetics in your head, it's time to replace it with Lisa's vision for apologetics, which is full of empathy. It's an apologetics that is acquainted with grief and pain and suffering. And it's an apologetic that takes a listening curiosity and an incarnational posture as much as an informational one. We'll have links in our show notes so you can discover Lisa, her organization, her book. Lisa, thank you so much for coming on Being Human.
Thank you for having me, Steve.